Okay, so I haven't done one of these tutorials in a while, but the question of scale mesh LODs came up, and I couldn't find a good tutorial online that covers Unreal in its current, most recent state. There are plenty of videos on how to do scale mesh LODs and static mesh LODs, but the scale mesh stuff looked out of date. So there are really cool tools built into Unreal now to handle scale mesh LODs. So this character is one of the Paragon characters. For those of you that don't know, Paragon was a game Unreal was developing, and Fortnite was making bank, and so they decided that they were not going to waste their time with Paragon anymore, and so they just made all that stuff for free. So if you want to start playing with art assets from Paragon to prototype out your game or stuff like that, you can download it for free. And this is one of those characters, and so this will make for a really nice test case. So she actually comes with LODs already, but I've deleted them for the purpose of going through this tutorial. So the first thing I want to do is describe what LODs are. LODs stand for level of detail. Now, the point of level of detail is to make the character efficient so you are not rendering stuff that you don't need. For example, let's go ahead and go to wireframe. And you can see the head with all the hair is just a mass, solid mass of vertices. Now, in real life, vertices are a single point in space. They don't have dimension. That is for us to visualize. But it does kind of represent just how cluttered this is. And as we zoom out, all those vertices basically become a silhouette. Now, remember, every 3 vertices represents a triangle, and if you have more triangles than you have pixels, then you're rendering faces you don't need to render. Imagine if you're zoomed out so far that an individual pixel represents 5 faces. It's got to render all 5 of those faces to figure out what color to shade that 1 pixel. That's a lot of work for very little gain. On top of that, every single one of these vertexes has got to be deformed when the character moves. The more vertices, the more calculations. So if you're all the way down here, does it really matter if every single one of those fingers is moving quite accurately, or if the folds in between the knuckles are bending just quite right? Because you can't see it from back here. So we want to optimize this mesh as it gets farther away, both in terms of rendering the mesh and calculating its deformations. Now this character actually has some cloth sim on it, and I'm not sure how the LODs are going to work with the cloth sim quite yet. So this will be a nice little experiment. But there's basically 3 panels we want to deal with when dealing with LODs. So up here is your material slots. This is for the base mesh. We can ignore this for now. This here is to pick between your LODs. Now, again, I deleted all the LODs, so right now there's none. The next set is, once you have that picked, these are the settings for that LOD. Now you'll notice it's got all the different shaders copied over. This is because, again, if the character is super far away, this shader may be doing a bunch of stuff that you just can't really see when the character is an inch high on the screen. Maybe this face shader is doing a bunch of normal map blendings or procedurally adding pores and all this kind of stuff that when she's that tiny, you just can't see. So you could, in theory, swap these shaders out with something that's more cost effective for when they're far enough away. And these are going to be our other settings for the LOD, including reduction size and things of that nature. We will get to that when we start generating our LODs. And this last bit is kind of a general LOD setting. Now right here, there's a slot for LOD settings. This is really nice. What this allows us to do is, let's say we have a recipe for LODs that we really like. The number of bones we're going to pull out, or number of bones per influences we're going to reduce it to, number of triangles we reduce, when the LODs pop, etc. and so forth. And let's say we're doing something like Paragon where we have like 20, 30, 40 characters. With this, we don't have to reset those every single time. We can export that out as a bunch of settings, and then on each mesh, just import the setting. Then on each mesh, import the settings and hit Generate Asset. Boom, we're done. Move on to the next one. So let's go ahead and create our LODs. Let's go ahead and change the LODs from 1 to 5. And we'll hit Apply Changes. Now Unreal is... Did I hit Apply? Yes, I did. Unreal is going to automatically set some default parameters for those settings as it generates the 4 new LODs that we are asking it to build. And this will take a couple minutes. There we go. That wasn't too bad. So now, if you look up in here, there's some very important information. One is going to tell you what your LOD is. It's going to tell you your screen size. That's important because that's going to determine when you pop LODs. And what I mean by pop LODs is when we switch to the next lower LOD. This is the number of triangles. Now remember, in a game engine, everything gets triangulated. If you are working in Maya or Max, you may be working in quads or triangles or whatever you're doing. I prefer working in quads myself. I think everybody should be modeling in quads because that's the way the tools are built, but that's my soapbox. I'll get off of that. But once it's in the engine, anything that's quads gets cut in half and turned into triangles. So the magic number is always going to be triangles. And it's also the number of vertices. Remember, every 3 vertexes represents a triangle. So with it on auto LOD, I can scroll out, and as I get to about 0.3, you see we popped to LOD 1. The number of triangles dropped. See here it's about 75. Here it's about 21. And if we keep going out even further, you can see here we drop by another half, and so on and so forth. Now we can preview those LODs by simply jumping through. And you can see as we go through, they get more and more mangled. So the idea is you want to find that perfect balance of how much to reduce it by with when you want to pop them. So let's look into our LOD1 setting here. We're going to scroll down here. Now notice when we go from LOD0 to LOD1, the cloth doesn't work. Let's see if we can fix that real quick. So if we go LOD0, we can see this has female apex hair, this has female apex hair, sorry. And then this down here has apex geocloth. So let's see if we can just set those. And I think these LODs were not generated automatically. I think they were generated ahead of time. There we go. So now we have hair on LOD1. So I believe those were made ahead of time. I don't think they were made when we did this automatic LOD stuff, which means as we go to lower LODs, we will lose the claw sim. Unless we go through and edit that. That's, I think, a different process. That you have to go through the cloth stuff. We can look at that if we have time. But let's get to the important part, which is generating the LODs. So as you saw, it doesn't pop till we hit 0.3, and 0.3 is way down there. And it's reducing it to 25% of its original polygon count. That's pretty aggressive. So I think we can pop earlier if we set it to 0.5, and then let's set the screen space to 1. Now no changes have taken place yet. Because I have not regenerated the LOD. Before we do that, let's look at some of these other options. So this is for remapping morph targets. So let's say she had a bunch of morph targets for facial animation or corrective blend shapes. This would allow us to copy that from the original mesh down to this LOD1. In this case, she doesn't have any morph targets or blend shapes. And again, if you're from Maya, it's blend shapes. If you're from Max, it's morph targets. They're the same thing. But she doesn't have any, so we can ignore that. This is the maximum bones per influence. Now, by default, that's set to 4. I believe Unreal can support up to 8, unless you're doing mobile. So, for now, we're going to leave this at 4, but as we go down the LODs, we can set this up to be way more aggressive. So this is percentage of triangles. 0.25 means 25%. So let's set that up to 0.5. Lock mesh edges is really a cool feature because what happens is, let's say she was in parts, and as you are reducing her, the edges are getting mangled and you're starting to see gaps. What this will do is try to preserve those edges and pull polygons somewhere else. In this case, I don't think it's necessary. But if she was built more if she was built in more of different pieces and everything like that, that might be vital for getting a good look. The last thing here is the base LOD. In other words, all these settings are referencing this LOD, which is right now set to 0. So for the next one, if it's still set to 0, I don't want to reduce it to 0.5. I want to reduce it to 0.25 of the original. But if I was going to do the next one and reduce it based on LOD1, I might want to keep it at 0.5 because it would be half of a half, if that makes any sense. Generally speaking, leave this to 0. There's only been one time when I've changed this, and that is when I had a LOD I manually had created. So LOD0 was very high res and was meant for cinematics. LOD1 was the original mesh before it had gotten smoothed out for cinematics. And so all my calculations were based off LOD1, not LOD0. So this is actually kind of a cool feature if you are wanting to manually create the first 1 or 2 LODs just to maintain quality. Like you're like, man, I can procedurally do this, but I really want to make sure that I get this in right or that in right or something like that. Then you can base it off of a different LOD and it'll generate from there. So I'm going to regenerate this LOD. And whoa, it did not like that cloth. Let's see if we can reset that. It looks like it went to the wrong one. That's interesting. There we go. Yeah, that got mix match when I regenerated it. That was weird. But that's been fixed. So now let's go to Auto LOD and let's see if we notice a difference. So when we go right about there is when we're popping, and we can't tell a difference. So we're only dropping about half the verts, but we're doing it way sooner. Because remember before, she didn't drop till way the hell down here. So we're not losing as many verts, but we're doing it way sooner. So we're getting more of a benefit. And it really depends on the type of game you're building. If you're doing something like Fortnite, where you got characters way in the vista, then maybe popping later is not a bad thing. But if you're doing something that has more close quarters, popping that late may not be very beneficial because you'll never be that far away. So this, I think, works nice. We're dropping half and we're not that far away. So then let's look at the next one. What's our next LOD? So because this cloth isn't working, we might want to pop that later, or we can try to fix it. So let's go ahead and change that. The last one was 0.5, so let's go 0.25. And again, that's 0.25 of the original mesh LOD. Now another thing we can do at this point, let's change the screen size setting to 0.5. Let's reduce the number of bones per influence. This will make the deformation a little bit cheaper as it gets farther away, because instead of having a max number of 4 verts or 4 influences on every vert, it'll have a max of 3. and that's 25% cheaper, worst case scenario. So let's regenerate that one. And so now again we can test that. So here we pop the 1. So the only thing that can really show us that we're popping is we no longer have the claw sim. And we can look to see if we can rebuild that LOD for that later. But let's get the rest of the LODs set up first, and then we'll look at that. If we can't, we can always increase that those settings so it pops later. So that was 2. So let's go to 3. And again, I usually go in increments of 50% as a good rule of thumb. Although if you do 50% and it just doesn't look right, then you know, change it. So we got 1 at, that's doing it at 1. 2 is doing it at 0.5. So 3 we can have it at, see, that's already at 0.1. Reduction settings, change it 125. So that was already set to 3, so let's put that down to 2 because we're getting really far away. Well, let's keep it at 3 for now. Another thing we can do is we can list the bones that we want to start removing. So, for example, let's go in here and say by the time she's that far away, we take out all these little fingertips. Now you can do entire hierarchies of bones. But right now I'm just doing the tips. Let's do one more. Okay, and then do the same for the other side. Because when she's that far away, I don't think we're going to notice if the tips of her fingers are not moving correctly. And then when we go to the next LOD, we can be even more aggressive. Okay, let's see what other joints we can possibly pull out of here. Let's see. So yeah, we got all these things here for the face. At this point, we're probably not going to see it. So let's just go ahead and take that whole chunk of the hierarchy and remove that. So let's go ahead and remove all that. And again, we can test it. So we're at LOD 1, 2, go all the way down here. Like that's like really far. That's ridiculously far. So we can probably pop sooner. Let's make her pop at about 0.25. Our screen size was set to 0? What? So 2 is 0.5. 3, we can do 0.25. There we go, 0.25. Oh, and this got changed, so let's set that back to 3. And this got changed. It got it's supposed to be 0.25, right? So 1, 50, 25. Okay, so we'll go ahead and regenerate all that. Okay, and then we'll test that again. Okay, so you can't really see any change going from 0 to 1. So the 2, the only change we see is that we no longer have cloth sim working. 0 to 3, we can't see anything. And that does look like it's far enough away that if her face was moving, we would never see it. Now, of course, we can always put in a sample animation and watch her move and look for those kind of things. Just come in here to the preview scene and uh, pull up an animation, and then you can test it. But I think for purposes of this demonstration, that's good enough. And so 4, let's get really crazy. Reduction settings, 0.06, because we did that big jump. Bones are going to set that down to 2. And then for bones to remove, we can remove like entire hands now. So we don't need any of that stuff when she's that far away. And then everything in the head. Basically that whole thing can go again. Anything else we can remove? Probably don't need those. Not when she's that far away. It's probably to give some secondary motion, some jiggling or something like that, but that is way over there. Let's see what else can we remove. We might be able to pull some of these joints out, but you know what, that's probably enough for now. Let's just delete that. And then max number of bones, we'll reduce that all the way down to 2, and then we'll regenerate that. And again, we can test that. So we'll go from 3 all the way down to, yeah, I think we're still popping way too late here. So what was that screen size? Screen size was 0.05, so 0.25. Let's change that to 0.1. Now, at some point, you're going to reduce it to the point where you have nothing. I mean, a minimum of 3 vertexes is a triangle. Right now, she's down to 2,500. So you can only push this so far. And remember, every LOD is going to add to your memory footprint. So it depends on the type of game you're making. But if you have something like Fortnite where you have this big, huge open world, making 4 or 5 LODs and being very aggressive might make sense. But if this is more of a dungeon crawler kind of thing, you might want to pop sooner, less reduction, that kind of thing. I mean, it's really up to you what works for your game. Okay, so for the last thing, let's go see what we can do about this cloth. So I'm not worried about the hair. We really can't see that moving. But here, we're going to create LOD from selection.
Sorry, I don't know that one.
This is the cloth, not the hair. We're going to add LOD2. Let's come in here and assign that. Okay. Okay, I'm recreating the cloth LOD, but every time I assign it, Unreal's crashing. So there might be a new bug in Unreal 2.4. But that would be how you're supposed to do it. That's how I've done it in the past. So take that with a grain of salt. But that is, in a nutshell, how you do your character LODs. So I will have to do some investigation on why creating the LOD for the Colosseum is crashing. It's actually not the creation, it's the assigning, so I'll have to look into that. So we'll leave that part a little bit unresolved. But other than that, that is Skeletal LODs in a nutshell. I hope that was useful to you, and thank you very much.